Sarah woke up early to prepare for the long flight ahead, the morning sun barely peeking through the windows as she gathered her uniform, and checked her schedule. The flight was routine New York to Los Angeles, nothing out of the ordinary. She had done it hundreds of times, but today felt different. A strange tension hung in the air. As she made her way to the airport, she couldn't put her finger on it. But something about the day felt off. The airport was crowded as always, passengers bustling through the terminals dragging luggage and rushing to gates. Sarah moved through the crowd with the efficiency she had perfected over years of flying, but a nagging thought kept tugging at her mind. Maybe it was the weather or the restless energy in the air. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be one of those days where nothing went right. She arrived at the gate and began her pre-flight checks. The crew was already getting ready. Boarding would begin soon. The usual announcements filled the air, but Sarah's eyes kept drifting to a woman seated in first class, an elderly lady dressed in a dark fur coat with sharp features that looked out of place amidst the usual business travelers and tourists. She was calm and collected, not one to stand out at first glance. But there was something about the way she sat, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room. It was almost as if she was observing everything and everyone around her. Sarah couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort as she caught the woman's gaze. For a brief moment, the old woman's stare was intense, but not threatening. It was almost calculating, as though she had seen much more than her years would suggest. The plane began to board, and Sarah moved down the aisle helping passengers find their seats. She smiled and greeted them as she usually did, but something about the elderly woman in first class kept drawing her attention. Each time Sarah passed by, she noticed the woman's eyes were on her, watching, not in a way that felt warm or welcoming, but in a way that made her skin prickle. She thought she was imagining it. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of the long flight or the noise of the crowded cabin, but it felt like the woman was studying her every move, as though she was waiting for something. Finally, as Sarah began her service routine, she made her way to first class to offer drinks and snacks. She moved towards the woman's seat with a practiced smile, but before she could speak, the elderly woman looked up at her with those piercing eyes and asked softly, "Could you help me with something?" Sarah nodded politely as she leaned closer, expecting another request for a drink or perhaps a blanket, but instead the woman's voice dropped even lower, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "I need some assistance with my medication. I'm not feeling quite well, but I'm sure you can help me." Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to it that Sarah couldn't quite place. Without thinking, Sarah replied curtly, "I'm sorry, I'm sure you'll be fine. Just let me know if you need anything." The woman's gaze never faltered. It stayed fixed on Sarah, as if she could see right through her. The flight attendant's response was sharp, too sharp maybe, but she didn't have time to indulge every request from passengers. Not with so much to do. The elderly woman said nothing, but her eyes seemed to linger a moment longer than usual. Then she looked away, and Sarah continued on with her duties. The rest of the flight went by as usual, but Sarah couldn't shake the odd feeling that the woman's eyes were always on her, no matter where she went, no matter how many other passengers she had to tend to. There was a quiet unease in the air. It was as if the woman was silently watching her every move. She began to feel like a character in some strange game, and she was the one being tested. By the time the flight began its descent, Sarah was ready for it to be over. But as she passed the elderly woman's seat one last time, she was met with a small smile, a smile that didn't reach the woman's eyes. And then came the words, "You don't know what you've just done, child." Sarah froze for a split second, but quickly composed herself. She smiled and nodded politely. "I'm sorry if I've done anything to upset you." But the woman's expression didn't change. It was as if she knew something Sarah didn't know, something that was about to change everything. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Sarah felt an unease settle in her stomach. She went through the motions of her duties, helping passengers gather their belongings and exit the aircraft, but her mind kept drifting back to the woman in first class who had spoken those strange words. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But what was it? Was it the woman's cryptic warning, or just the usual tension of a long flight? Sarah tried to dismiss it as just her imagination working overtime. But as she watched the passengers disembark, there was something about the woman's expression that stayed with her. Those cold eyes still lingered in her mind. Sarah shrugged it off and moved through her post-flight routine, thinking the encounter would fade into memory like so many others. But as she stepped out of the terminal and made her way to the crew lounge to rest, before her next shift her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from the airline's internal system, a routine email, she thought. But when she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. It was an invitation to a mandatory meeting with HR. The subject line was unsettling: immediate attention required. The words didn't make sense to her. Why would they need to meet with her? Everything had gone smoothly during the flight. There hadn't been any complaints. Nothing had stood out except for that strange moment with the elderly woman. But surely that didn't warrant anything serious, did it? Sarah felt her palms begin to sweat as she made her way to the HR office, her mind racing with possibilities. What could it be? Why did they want to meet with her? When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt different, cold, sterile, almost as if the very air was charged with something unspoken. She stepped inside and was greeted by two senior members of the airline's HR team, both of whom she had seen before, but never had a conversation with. They didn't offer the usual pleasantries, just stern nods, and motioned for her to sit down. Sarah felt the weight of their gaze as they silently watched her take her seat. "We'll get straight to the point, Sarah," one of them said. His tone was clipped and businesslike. "There has been an incident that requires your immediate attention." Sarah's throat tightened, her heart thudded in her chest. "What kind of incident?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We received a complaint," the other HR representative said, their eyes meeting hers. "A complaint about your conduct during a recent flight." Sarah's mind raced, but she couldn't recall anything out of the ordinary. She had done everything by the book. The flight had been typical, except for the weird exchange with the elderly woman. But that couldn't be what they were talking about, surely. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." The HR representatives exchanged a glance before one of them spoke again. "It's about a passenger. You interacted with her in first class. Her name is Evelyn Harrington." Sarah's stomach lurched at the mention of the name. She had no idea who the woman was. She had barely spoken to her during the flight, just a brief exchange. But now it felt like everything had changed. Evelyn Harrington. Sarah repeated the name slowly, trying to recall any details about the woman's appearance. "I don't know her." "She is not just any passenger," the HR representative continued. "Evelyn Harrington is a tech mogul and a major stakeholder in several multinational companies. She is known for being private and for maintaining a low profile." Sarah's blood ran cold as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The woman wasn't just some elderly traveler. She was one of the most powerful and influential people in the business world, and she had been watching Sarah. "We've been notified of a formal complaint she filed against you," the other HR representative added. "She claims that you treated her disrespectfully during the flight and that you refused to assist her when she asked for help." Sarah's mind went blank for a moment. The pieces of the encounter slowly began to come together: the strange eyes, the cryptic warning, and now this powerful woman had filed a complaint against her. But why would she do that? What could Sarah have possibly done to provoke such a reaction? The HR team went on to explain that the complaint had caused a stir within the company, and beyond the repercussions were already being felt. They couldn't go into specifics, but Sarah had unknowingly become part of a much bigger story than she could have ever imagined. Her world began to spin as she realized the full scope of what she was up against. The woman's warning echoed in her mind. "You don't know what you've just done, child." Sarah sat frozen as the words from HR echoed in her mind. Evelyn Harrington, a name she had never heard before, yet now it was at the center of her world, as if her life had suddenly twisted into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She tried to grasp the reality of what was happening, but everything felt surreal. How could a simple moment of impatience with an elderly passenger lead to this? She wanted to scream, but instead she sat there feeling as though the walls were closing in on her. The HR team continued to speak, but their words sounded muffled now, like she was underwater. They explained how Evelyn Harrington wasn't just a quiet tech mogul. She was an influential figure. Her wealth was vast, and her power extended into areas Sarah never could have imagined. She had contacts in government, entertainment, finance, and technology, and all of them knew her name. Sarah's mind spun with the realization that her careless actions had somehow brought her into contact with someone who was not just a passenger, but a force to be reckoned with. They told Sarah that the complaint was serious. It wasn't just about the way she had dismissed Evelyn's request for help. It was about how she had treated someone who could have destroyed her career in an instant. But Sarah didn't know any of this. She didn't know the woman was important. She didn't know that her offhanded comment about helping her had been seen as an insult, something unforgivable in the eyes of someone like Evelyn. The weight of the situation pressed down on Sarah, and she felt her chest tighten as if she couldn't breathe. Every part of her screamed in panic, but there was nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide. She was in deep now. "We're going to have to let you go, Sarah," one of the HR reps said, his words cutting through the haze of panic that had consumed her. "There's nothing we can do. The backlash from this has been overwhelming. The media is starting to pick up on the story. We can't afford to be linked to something like this." Sarah's heart sank. She was being fired. She had worked so hard for this job for years, and now it was slipping through her fingers over something as trivial as a single interaction, a single moment of poor judgment. And yet it felt like the universe that conspired to make it all unravel in an instant. "Is there no way to fix this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. She tried to find some kind of escape, some way to salvage what was left of her career, but the HR representatives remained silent, their eyes cold and unfeeling. "We've already received instructions from the higher-ups," the other rep said. "There's nothing more we can do. You'll need to clear out your things and leave immediately." The room seemed to spin as Sarah stood up, her legs weak and unsteady. She felt the weight of every moment that had led up to this, the way she had treated Evelyn so dismissively, without knowing who she was or what she represented. She felt the sting of regret, sharper than any pain she had ever known, but it was too late to undo it. As she walked out of the office, her mind was a whirlwind of questions. How had she gotten here? How had a single decision destroyed everything she had worked for? But there was one thought that burned brighter than the rest. The woman's warning still echoed in her mind. "You don't know what you've just done, child." And now Sarah was beginning to understand. It wasn't just a warning, it was a judgment. It was a reminder that in life you couldn't afford to overlook anyone, not even the quietest of people, not even those who seemed powerless, because you never knew who they really were or what power they held. The next few days were a blur. Sarah packed up her belongings and left the airline. She spent sleepless nights trying to make sense of what had happened, but it felt like the pieces wouldn't fit together. She couldn't understand why Evelyn had gone so far to ruin her life over a single encounter, and yet everything about that moment felt deliberate. It was as if the woman had been waiting for her to make a mistake, and she had delivered with the precision of someone who had seen it all before. Sarah was left with nothing but the feeling of emptiness as she realized how quickly her world had been turned upside down, all because of one passenger and a moment of poor judgment. Days passed, but the weight of what had happened lingered over Sarah like a dark cloud she couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, the world outside felt distant and muffled, as though she were walking through a fog. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn Harrington, the woman whose face had become etched in her mind, whose warning now haunted every waking moment. Sarah had made a mistake, and she knew it, but the consequences were far worse than she could have ever imagined. Sarah tried to distract herself from the overwhelming regret that had taken root inside her, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's piercing gaze and heard those words again. "You don't know what you've just done, child." The warning echoed over and over in her mind, as though it was trapped in a loop she couldn't break out of. One evening she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through the endless notifications on her phone as her thoughts swirled around the events of the past week. She had already lost her job at the airline, but the news didn't end there. Her name had made its way into the press, and social media whispers about the flight attendant who angered a tech mogul circulated online. People were calling her careless. They were calling her disrespectful. She couldn't even scroll through her own feeds without seeing articles written about her. The words stung like 1,000 paper cuts, and no matter how many times she tried to ignore them, they always found their way back into her mind. Just as she was about to shut off her phone, a notification caught her eye, a message from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it made her blood run cold. "Evelyn is watching." At first Sarah thought it was a joke, but the sense of dread that crept up her spine told her otherwise. Who could have known about what happened? How could anyone be watching her? She stared at the message for a long time, her hands trembling, but no follow-up message came. It was just that one chilling sentence, and then silence. Sarah knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit back and let her life crumble further. She needed answers. She needed to find Evelyn and figure out what had really happened. She had to know why a single moment of poor judgment had ruined her entire future. But where to start? She had no way of reaching Evelyn. The tech mogul's life was shrouded in secrecy. Everything about her was carefully controlled. There was no contact information, no public appearance, no way to get through to her. Sarah felt a growing panic in her chest, but she didn't have much of a choice. She couldn't live in limbo forever. She had to find a way to make it right. She started by searching the web for anything she could find about Evelyn Harrington and her empire. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how little was known about the woman. Everything seemed to point to one thing: Evelyn was a ghost, someone who had built an empire from the shadows. Her name was known, but her true self was hidden beneath layers of control. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she realized how carefully Evelyn had crafted her life to avoid detection. Even her wealth was rumored but never confirmed. After hours of fruitless searching, Sarah's frustration grew. She was no closer to finding answers, and the more she thought about Evelyn, the more the unease grew. What if the woman was watching her right now? What if she had somehow become the object of this mogul's scrutiny? And why hadn't Evelyn simply let it go? Why drag it out? Why make Sarah suffer? As Sarah sat back in her chair, her phone buzzed again, the same unknown number this time. There was a new message attached to it. "You can't outrun this." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her palms went clammy. As she read the words over and over, the message felt like a threat. But was it truly a threat? Or was it just someone playing with her emotions? She wanted to delete the message, to block the number, but something stopped her. Something inside told her this wasn't over, not by a long shot. In that moment, Sarah realized something terrifying. She wasn't just dealing with the consequences of her actions anymore. She was being hunted. She was being watched. And the woman who had issued the warning wasn't finished with her yet. Sarah's hands shook as she stared at the phone screen. The words, "You can't outrun this," burned into her mind like an irreversible mark. She had been living in fear for days now, not knowing who was watching her, or why the world she once knew seemed to be crumbling around her at an alarming speed. Every new message, every new rumor only deepened the pit of dread that had settled in her stomach. She had tried to ignore it, tried to move on, but it was clear now that nothing would be the same again. The hours felt endless as Sarah sat in her apartment, lost in a haze of worry and confusion. It was as if her mind refused to accept the reality of what was happening. She kept asking herself, how did a simple mistake turn into this? How had her life spiraled so out of control? In such a short time she never thought her one brush with an elderly woman would lead her to this dark and twisted place. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. The shadows in her room felt like they were closing in on her thoughts, bouncing between the unknown number, the unsettling messages, and the woman who had set this all into motion. Evelyn Harrington. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she really? What did she want? Why had she made Sarah her target? A sudden knock on her door made Sarah's heart leap into her throat. She froze for a moment, her body tense, every part of her screamed to run. But there was nowhere to go, no place that could offer safety. She took a slow step toward the door and peeked through the peephole. Her pulse quickened. When she saw no one standing there, just an envelope resting on the floor, Sarah's breath caught in her chest. As she reached down to pick it up, her fingers trembling, she opened it slowly, as though afraid of what she might find inside. The letter inside was short, but its impact was immediate. "You've been warned." It read in bold black letters. Beneath it was a single sentence that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th and Main tomorrow night. No one else can know. You'll regret it if you don't." Sarah stared at the note, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Who had left this at her door? Was it Evelyn? Was this some kind of sick game? Or was this a final warning? The idea of meeting whoever was behind this terrified her. But a part of her knew there was no choice now. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep hiding. She had to face whatever this was, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. The warehouse mentioned in the letter was located in a rundown part of the city known for its abandoned buildings and dark alleys. Sarah had never been there before, and she certainly didn't plan on walking into it blindly, but something inside her told her she had no other option. The fear of the unknown, the terror of what might happen next kept her up all night, until the morning light finally broke through the darkness of her thoughts. By the time nightfall came, Sarah was preparing to leave her apartment. She dressed carefully, no makeup, no jewelry, just a simple jacket and jeans. She didn't want to attract attention. She didn't want to make it obvious that she was walking into a trap. She grabbed a flashlight and slipped the letter into her pocket. As she left her apartment, the city streets felt more alive than ever, and yet everything felt eerily quiet. She was walking into the unknown, not knowing what waited for her at the warehouse, or what she would face when she got there. As she neared 5th and Main, Sarah felt a chill creep down her spine. The area was desolate, empty save for the towering structures that loomed over her. She could see the faint outline of the warehouse in the distance, its windows dark and empty. The air around her seemed thick with tension, and with every step she took, she felt like someone was watching her, but she couldn't tell who or from where. When Sarah reached the entrance to the warehouse, she hesitated for a moment. Her breath shallow. The door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for her to step inside. She pushed it open slowly, the creak of the door echoing in the silence of the night. The shadows inside were deep and impenetrable, but she took a step forward anyway, determined to face whatever lay ahead. "Sarah." The voice came from the darkness, a soft whisper, but one that made her freeze in place. Her heart stopped for a moment as she heard the familiar tone. It was Evelyn's voice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard Evelyn's voice floating from the shadows. Her body went rigid, every muscle tense, and every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. But her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness where the voice had come from. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but her heart was racing, her palms slick with sweat. "Evelyn," she whispered barely above her breath. There was a long pause before the voice spoke again, softer this time. "You've been a very difficult person to track down, Sarah." The words hung in the air, as if they were meant to draw out every ounce of fear from her soul. "I didn't expect you to come tonight, But I suppose you understand now that there are things you can't outrun no matter how far you try." Sarah's throat went dry. She took a step forward into the shadows, hoping her eyes would adjust, but the darkness swallowed her whole. The smell of dust and decay filled the air, and everything around her felt wrong. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" A low laugh echoed through the warehouse, as if Evelyn were standing right next to her, but Sarah still couldn't see her. The sound was chilling, and sent a shiver racing up her spine. "What I want is simple." Sarah Evelyn's voice seemed to grow more intense. "I want you to understand the consequences of your actions, the ones you never even thought about when you decided to ignore me." Sarah's mind raced back to the flight, the strange encounter in first class, how she had brushed off the woman's request for help, how she had never once thought about what might happen if she crossed the wrong person. Evelyn wasn't just some helpless old lady. She was someone powerful, someone dangerous. And now Sarah had become a part of her story. "I didn't know who you were," Sarah said, quickly trying to explain herself. But her words sounded weak even to her ears. "I didn't know." "And now you do," Evelyn replied, her voice sharp as a knife. "You didn't bother to learn who I was, did you? You saw an old woman and assumed she was harmless. But you were wrong." Evelyn paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "You were wrong about me, Sarah, and that mistake has consequences." Sarah's pulse hammered in her chest as the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just about a single moment of poor judgment anymore. This was something bigger, something that stretched far beyond the flight, and the small part of the world Sarah had known up until now. She had somehow crossed paths with a woman who didn't play by the same rules as everyone else. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat tight with fear. "Tell me and I'll do it." She didn't know why she said it. She didn't even know what she was offering. But she knew there was no way out, not without facing whatever Evelyn had in store for her. Another pause stretched between them, as if Evelyn were considering her words carefully. "I want you to understand what power really is," Evelyn said finally. "You've lived in a world where you thought you could make your own choices and face no real consequences. But the truth is, Sarah, some people have more control than others." Her voice lowered to a whisper. "I gave you a chance to fix things before, but now I'm afraid it's too late for that." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean it's too late?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "What are you going to do to me?" Evelyn stepped forward from the darkness, and Sarah gasped, her eyes straining to catch a glimpse of her face in the dim light. But Evelyn was a shadow herself, her silhouette tall and imposing. "What I'm going to do," Evelyn said, her voice calm but cold, "is something you'll never forget. You'll learn exactly what it means to make a powerful enemy and live with the consequences." Sarah's mind was racing, her body paralyzed with fear. What did she mean by that? Was this the end for her? Would she lose everything she had left? "You'll never be the same after this, Sarah." Evelyn said, her voice low and steady, as if she were speaking from a place far removed from any human emotion. "You'll see the world differently. You'll never forget what you've done and what I've shown you here tonight." With that, Evelyn turned and started to move deeper into the warehouse, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Sarah was left standing frozen in the dark, her mind scrambling to make sense of the threat that had just been delivered. But as Evelyn's presence grew more distant, Sarah realized something terrifying. She wasn't just facing a dangerous woman, she was facing someone who could destroy her completely without a second thought. Sarah stood motionless as Evelyn's footsteps faded into the dark. The air was thick with dread. Sarah could feel the cold creeping into her bones, her heart still racing from the confrontation. Everything felt surreal, like she was caught in some twisted dream. She wanted to scream, to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. A dark presence seemed to hang in the air, and Sarah knew she was no longer in control of her fate. She tried to steady her breath, But it came in shallow gasps, her mind racing, as she replayed Evelyn's words over and over. "You'll never be the same after this." The weight of the statement crushed her. She felt like she was sinking into a pit of helplessness. But she couldn't let herself go there, not yet. She had to understand what was happening. She had to find a way out. Sarah's eyes darted around the warehouse, looking for anything that could give her a clue, but all she saw were dark corners and rusted metal shadows creeping along the walls. She could barely make out anything beyond the faint outline of the structure. Everything felt like it was closing in on her. She took a tentative step forward, but as she did, a soft noise echoed from the far corner of the room. It was the sound of something moving slowly, almost deliberately. Sarah's breath hitched, her pulse spiked. She froze, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever was lurking in the dark to reveal itself. Another step, and then another, until she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not Evelyn's this time. No, these were different, slow, deliberate footfalls, echoing in the silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe. Suddenly the figure emerged from the shadows, and Sarah's eyes widened. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in the dark. But his presence was enough to send a surge of fear through her veins. He stopped a few feet away from her, and in that moment Sarah could feel the intensity of the situation, like a tightrope ready to snap. "What do you want?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't keep the fear from seeping into her words. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his eyes scanning her every move, as if he were trying to read her every thought. Sarah could feel his gaze like a weight pressing down on her chest. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Evelyn wants you to understand the game you're in now." "What game?" Sarah managed to ask, though her voice was barely more than a whisper, her hands trembling. The man chuckled darkly. "The game where you don't get to decide your fate anymore." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You made a mistake by crossing her. You thought you could ignore the consequences. But now you're in this, whether you like it or not." Sarah's mind was racing. What did he mean? What did Evelyn want her to understand? How had she gotten into this mess? "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what she meant to anyone." The man's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem. You never know who you're dealing with. Not everyone is what they seem, but Evelyn is different. She doesn't let things slide like others. She makes sure people learn from their mistakes." He took another step forward. "And now you'll learn too." Fear coursed through Sarah's veins. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape. But her legs were frozen in place. She couldn't escape from this man, from this place. Not now. She was trapped. "What is it you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. The man didn't answer at first. He just continued to study her, as if weighing her every word and every gesture. Finally he spoke again, his tone cold and final. "Evelyn wants you to understand the consequences of underestimating people like her." He took a deep breath, as if savoring the moment. "She's going to teach you something you'll never forget. And once you understand the lesson, it'll be too late to undo it." Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The man's words felt like a death sentence. She had no idea what Evelyn was planning, but whatever it was, she knew it wouldn't be easy to escape from. She had unknowingly walked into a trap, a game where the rules were controlled by someone far more powerful than her. "You'll be tested, Sarah." The man added, his voice low and ominous. "Evelyn doesn't let anyone walk away from her lessons without learning something. You're going to learn exactly what it means to make an enemy like her." The darkness around Sarah seemed to close in on her, as the man's words, sunk in the weight of everything that had happened, was beginning to crush her. She had thought she could walk away from this, but now it felt like she was already too deep to turn back. With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Sarah was left standing alone, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was deafening. She could feel the tension in the air thickening. She wasn't just a pawn in this game anymore. She was part of a much larger story, a story that she didn't know how to escape from. Sarah stood alone in the dark, her thoughts swirling as the silence of the warehouse pressed in on her. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a move every breath. She seemed to echo louder than the weight of the unknown pressing on her chest. Like a vice, the man's words still haunted her. "You'll be tested." The air around her felt thick with unease, and her mind was racing. She had no idea what this test was or what Evelyn had planned for her, but it was clear now that she had made a mistake that wasn't going to be easily forgiven. She had thought she could walk away from this, but now it felt as though she was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. She turned and looked around the warehouse again, her eyes straining to find any sign of life, but the place was still and silent. As ever, the walls towered above her dark and imposing the few beams of moonlight creeping through the cracks in the ceiling, offering little comfort. It was hard to believe this place was real. It felt like something out of a bad dream. Her thoughts flickered to her life. Before all of this, the simple days of serving passengers. On a plane, the mundane routine of her job. It felt like a lifetime ago now, like she had stepped into a different world, one where every step she took led her deeper into danger, deeper into a web of mystery she didn't understand. Then, without warning, she heard it again, a soft sound barely audible at first, but then growing louder, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty space of the warehouse. Sarah's heart began to race again. Her palms were clammy, and her throat was dry. She couldn't see anything, but she knew someone was coming, someone who had the power to change everything again. The footsteps stopped just behind her, and Sarah froze. She didn't turn around. She couldn't bring herself to face whoever it was this time. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment and whispered to herself, "You have to stay calm. You have to stay calm." Sarah. The voice came from behind her and sent a jolt of electricity through her body. It was Evelyn's voice, calm yet chilling, as if she had all the time in the world to make Sarah feel small, to make her feel insignificant. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't bring herself to speak. She was too afraid to show any weakness, too afraid to let Evelyn see how terrified she truly was. "I've been waiting for you," Evelyn said, her voice soft and almost too serene. "I wondered how long it would take for you to realize the truth." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, to explain the mistake she had made, but the words wouldn't come. Evelyn moved closer, her presence filling the air around Sarah like a heavy fog. "You didn't know what you were dealing with, did you?" Evelyn continued. "You thought you could brush me off and go on with your life. But life doesn't work like that, Sarah. Sometimes you make a choice, and that choice follows you no matter how far you run." Sarah's mind raced, the fear in her chest beginning to give way to something else. Was this the test? She was being forced to face the reality that every choice she made could have irreversible consequences. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. As she turned to face the woman standing behind her, the shadows obscured Evelyn's face, but Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze, the force of her presence. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn let out a soft laugh, one that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "What do I want from you?" She repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "I want you to understand what it means to cross someone like me. I want you to see the price of your mistake. I want you to see just how far someone like me can reach." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. Evelyn wasn't just a woman. She was a force. She was someone who had the power to control everything around her, to manipulate the world to her will, and Sarah had been foolish enough to cross her. "Do you feel it?" Evelyn asked, her voice growing colder. "Do you feel the weight of everything you've done?" Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself on the cold concrete. She wanted to beg for mercy, to plead with Evelyn to take it all back, but deep down she knew it wouldn't matter. Evelyn watched her, without a word, her silence speaking louder than any threat ever could. Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on her, as if Evelyn was waiting for her to break. "I should have never crossed you," Sarah whispered, barely audible, her voice thick with regret. Evelyn's gaze softened ever so slightly. "You'll learn more than just that tonight, Sarah," she said softly. "Tonight you'll learn exactly what happens when you make an enemy out of someone like me." With that, Evelyn turned and began to walk away, her footsteps echoing once more through the vast emptiness of the warehouse, leaving Sarah alone in the dark, her heart racing, her mind screaming for answers she couldn't grasp, the feeling of dread growing stronger with every passing second. She realized she was only just beginning to understand the true cost of her mistake.